All settle down. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this morning's seminar titled Policing and Human Rights in South Africa. My name is Gareth Newham. I head what is called the Justice and Violence Prevention Program here at the Institute for Security Studies. Tomorrow we will be celebrating our 23rd Human Rights Day, a time to remember that most of South Africa's history was characterized by an absence of rights for most people in the country. And we thought it would be an opportune time to host today's seminar to reflect a bit on human rights, particularly with regards to policing, of which we'll say a bit more in a moment. But we're very fortunate today to have quite a broad number of speakers, and thanks to Donna Evans from Sonke Gender Justice to help put this program together. But before I get into all the details of the program and what we'll be discussing and the objective of the seminar and the structure of the seminar, I would like to just quickly welcome to the podium David Eggleston, who's the first Sonke Gender Justice and SWET, and the volunteer Donna Evans, who've been working with SWET and who did this research. They were responsible for helping fund that. So I'll ask Mr. Eggleston to give us a few words before I go into the rest of the program. So thank you. Welcome to the panel.
Okay, and thank you very much, Gareth, and thank you very much for allowing us to be here today and for us to welcome the event today. And look, thanks again, Gareth, and also to the Institute of Security Studies for all their work that they've been doing on this topic of positive policing. The Australian Government is proud to have supported Sonke Gender Justice to produce the Policing of Sex Work in South Africa report through the placement of our wonderful Australian volunteer, Donna Evans. And thank you, Donna, for all your work over the last few years, for all the stories and discussions you've had, and also to Dr. Rebecca Walker of the African Centre for Migration and Society, who has also assisted Donna. I would especially like to thank the participants in the study who have shared their stories with Donna. I can imagine that this is not an easy task, and I can only imagine the difficulties that have a lot of people have had and the courage in explaining their stories. But without you, we wouldn't be here today to be able to discuss those stories. I also acknowledge the support of the German government, the Open Society Foundation for South Africa, and Oxfam for publishing the report. So without further ado, I might pass back to Gareth to then introduce the speakers. But look, thank you once again, and look, we're very much looking forward to hearing the discussion today and to ensuring that this dialogue continues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So 23 years ago is when I first started to take an interest in work on policing matters in South Africa. And it was a very different time than it is today. South Africa had just seen the birth of its democracy. There was a lot of hope and optimism, in some ways like we have now, a lot of hope and optimism looking forward to the future. And I think the South African Police Service has come an incredibly long way compared to then. I've personally found it a privilege and an honor to work with many police officers across the organization in different parts of the country and at different levels. Certainly, if it's a calling for you, you join a police service because you want to do good in your community, because you believe it's one way of helping people, it's one way of preventing crime, helping people who might need help. And it's something that is usually quite a deep calling for people who become dedicated professional police officials. And so that's one of the many positive, it's been a very positive experience in that way for me. At the same time, in a difficult country like South Africa, a very diverse country, a country marked by incredible inequality between peoples, with a very high level of unemployment, high levels of poverty, it's an incredibly difficult country to police. We have a really high violent crime rate in South Africa. Our murder rate, as of last year, was about 34 murders per 100,000. This is about 5 to 6 times higher than the international average for murders. In some communities, that murder rate goes up to close to 300 murders per 100,000. You might be interested to know that there are 12% of the 1,144 precincts have a zero murder rate, but that's only 12%. But that indicator just demonstrates that the kinds of challenges facing the police on a daily basis is quite extraordinary and quite different to many other countries. That leads to a lot of stress on police officers. We see, for example, a lot of police officials suffer from post-traumatic stress. And I'm glad to see that one of our speakers today comes from the Employee Health and Wellness Program in the police. And it can lead to a range of other practices and problems that policing agencies under such stress experience. And I think one of the challenges is that whereas there are many dedicated good men and women in the South African Police Service, there are also far too many police officials who probably shouldn't be there. And as our current Minister of Police, Becky Cele, said when he was the Commissioner a while back, was that in the big recruitment processes that took place between 2002 to about 2012, the focus was too much on quantity. We want to get the numbers up. So the size of the South African Police Service grew from about 132,000 people in 2002 to almost 200,000 people 10 years later, when the capacity for the organization to vet, recruit, train was sitting around 3,000 or 4,000 per year. Suddenly it was recruiting and training double that, about 8,000. And so the ability to make sure that every one of the new recruits was properly vetted, that they had all the minimum criteria was in place, that they understood the training, was able to implement the training they'd learned. There's a lot of focus on human rights in the first 5 to 6 years of the police. Obviously, it wasn't as good as it should be. And then we saw from about 2009 onwards what the National Planning Commission under the Deputy or Commissioner then was our current President, Cyril Ramaphosa, termed a crisis of top management in the South African Police Service. And this is pretty much quite characterized by the fact that following the conviction of former National Commissioner Jackie Selebe in 2010, there have been 6 different people to occupy that post in 9 years. Currently, we have an experienced police official. Kekla Setole is a general who's been in the organization for many decades. But for most of that time, up until quite recently, the person occupying the National Commissioner's post was not a police official. And we've seen a lot of chaos that brings. So when the top of an organization that is quite hierarchical in nature, people need to be able to look up at their top commanders and feel that there's a role model. That's the man or woman I want to be like. And if I work hard, if I uphold the law, if I do good in my community, I'll be recognized, I'll be promoted, I'll have a long and fruitful career in an organization, I'll be seen as a professional. And there are lots of people who want that in the South African Police Service, and that's why we do the work we do. We want that too. But when you have a crisis where some of the people at the top of the organization maybe shouldn't be there, I'm thinking of people like Lieutenant General Richard Mdluli, who's irregularly appointed and is currently facing criminal charges, and various others can be named, but it causes destabilization up there. And it means that far too many other people join the police for less than noble reasons. And so you do have police officials across the country who see it as an opportunity to take chances, to be involved in corruption, to misuse the powers they are given to do good, they do badly, they do it for bad. And so you have a challenge there as well. And that's why we can't take our eyes off those challenges. We have a vision of a police agency that is highly respected and trusted by all communities in South Africa. And as international policing expert Professor Bailey once says, you want a police agency so that every parent in the country says to their children, if you get lost or if you need help, find a police officer. And unfortunately, from some surveys, we know that in some communities, up to 30 or 40% of people will not say that. They will say, if you see a police officer, head in the other direction. And so we've got to change that situation. And that is today's reflection on policing and human rights. There are many positive things in the South African Police Service. There are many good characteristics. There are many things we can build on. And so today is not just about saying, well, here's research that shows there's a problem. The police know there's a problem. We all know there's a problem. But it's about saying, if we have these problems, how do we make sure that we address these problems going forward so that even the most vulnerable people in the country feel that they can trust the police? Because the job of the police is not to punish. That's the job of the courts. The police are there to be trained professionals who follow very clear regulations, who uphold everybody's rights to dignity and make sure that they treat everybody fairly. And if they do that, then all communities will support the police. And the benefits are that people who commit serious violent crimes such as murder, robbery, rape, those are the ones who will find less space in the communities to operate because people will inform the police who they are because they trust the police to do the right thing. The police's job will become easier and the police's job will become safer. So in very essence, we need to be able to continually work together with the police and amongst different agencies to do things that changes the narrative and the vision of the police. We can't say, well, here's a crime problem and it's something the police must deal with. Crime is a complex challenge facing any country. We have a particular problem with that, but we're not going to do it. We're not going to get on top of improving our policing or improving our crime situation if we don't work together, if we're not able to share ideas. And it is difficult because some of the stuff we're about talking today is not pleasant for the police to hear. It's not pleasant for people to share their stories. But as I say, it's not all bad news. So we need to be able to find a way of moving forward. So without further ado, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank our sponsors. The Hans Seidel Foundation funds a lot of our criminal justice work, so does the Open Society Foundation. And we're also grateful to the members of our partnership forum, which include the European Union and the governments of Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United States of America. We will start with Donna Evans, who is the principal researcher. Then she'll give us a short briefing, about 15 minutes, on the findings of the research, and she's policy and advocacy from the Policy and Advocacy Unit at the Sonke Gender Justice. We then have Nosipo Vildima, who's from the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force, also known as SWET. We will then, after that, probably take a short break for questions and answers to talk a bit about the research side of things. And then we will move on to a second panel consisting of Lieutenant Colonel Torko Mota, who's from the Employee Health and Wellness Service of the South African Police Service. We then have Dr. Connie Naka, who's an executive manager of the NSP unit from the South African National AIDS Council. We're then fortunate also to have Mobiselo Botha, who's a commissioner of the Commission for Gender Equality, and from the Gauteng Department of Community Safety, director at the Ikaya Letemba Victim Empowerment Center, Ms. Marita Ground. And then we also have the African Police Civilian Oversight Forum's research director, Dr. Simon Howell, who will give a bit more perspective of some of the areas they're working on policing in South Africa. So I will have to be quite a strict chair because, as you can see, if some of our speakers have not yet arrived, but if they all arrive, they literally have 10 minutes each, and I'll have to then cut them off after 10 minutes so we have some time for engagement. But thank you again very much for coming today. I hope you enjoy the seminar. I hope you found it useful. I'll now invite Donna Evans to the podium.
I have my stopwatch. I'd just like to apologise too for Gareth for loading so many speakers onto the program. It has made the day a little bit difficult time-wise, but I think it's important that we try and hear as many voices as we can. The sex work sector doesn't have many opportunities to gather a quite diverse range of people together to have a conversation, and that's what today is about. This research document is to start a conversation. It is only the beginning of the conversation. What I would like to suggest people do is to look at this document through a positive frame, a positive lens. This document can help us work out where to go in the future, what steps to take, what priorities we recognise from it, and what actions we can take on an individual level, but also as a group or a cooperative group working towards improving the current situation. My background is as a lawyer by trade. I come from a criminal justice system, so magistrate after hours magistrate, working a lot with police over a period of nearly 25 years. I am no enemy of the police. It is a very difficult job to do. It is incredibly difficult, and operational policing is very challenging. I think we need to recognise the difficulties that do happen on a day-to-day basis that SAPs are confronted with. One thing that is very challenging is actually finding out what is going on at the grassroots level of operational policing. What is going on at that point of interaction between members of the community and operational police? There's no supervisor over SAP's shoulders when they're out on the beat. Even within the police station, the station commander is not in all places. It's very, very difficult to actually receive feedback and understand what's happening at that very pointy intersection between the public and operational policing. One of the few ways to do that is through complaints processes, to actually take feedback from people who are interacting with your service And that's what this document forms to a large extent. It is the voices of 120 people who have had interactions directly with SAPS, and this is their experience. There's nothing contentious about it. We're not taking matters to court. We're not arguing in any forum about the validity of everybody's recollection, but it gives you a very good picture of what 120 people are saying is their experience at that front line of policing. Why was the research initiated in the first place? There was a very large volume of quite serious complaints coming in from sex workers, and it was continual. There's a continual form of emergency response that is draining the resources of a lot of these civil society organisations to try and manage on an individual level, incident after incident. Attempts by the services, the advocacy services and support services, to address matters at station level and with individual officers, they've not been very successful. The sex work sector has not been able to break into the policing hierarchy and to make those connections and form those relationships that enable proper transmission of information so that we can then together look at some of the challenges that are happening out in the operational playing field. So I'm calling this report Opportunity Knocks. Here is a document that provides an example of what service satisfaction is, what the service experience is for one specific group of people in the community. And those people are sex workers. What we do need to recognise here in South Africa is that sex work is 100% criminalised. There is no question about that. The buying of sex, the selling of sex, the benefiting from the proceeds of commercial sex, all of those constitute criminal offences, and that is certainly not disputed here today. At that same time, sex workers are members of the community, and they are eligible and deserve all the other human rights and the benefits of all the laws that protect everybody in the country. By choosing sex work as a livelihood, that does not exclude people from access to human rights. If there is an incident that requires an arrest to happen, what should happen is that the arrest occurs according to legislation, procedures and protocols. And that's where the service breakdown is really clearly demonstrated through that research report. We also need to be clear on what we're talking about when we say sex work. We are talking about people over 18 years of age who are consensually selling sex. We are not talking about people under 18 years of age. We are not talking about people who have been trafficked. We are not talking about people who have been coerced. We are only talking at this point about people, adults, who voluntarily engage in commercial sex work as a livelihood. And certainly the 120 people who participated in this research activity were all consensual sex workers. Okay. I think that's very important because what I've come across in a lot of circumstances is trafficking and sex work is often conflated. I think we know that the economic circumstances are very difficult for a lot of people, and sex work is recognised in various places in the world as a livelihood option. And that's the only context that we are talking about it here today. Okay. There are a lot of acknowledgements on the inside of the report. I'm not going to go back through those. I would like to, of course, acknowledge Dr. Rebecca Walker, the co-author of it, and also the main sponsors, Sonke Gender Justice and SWEAT. Okay. The design of the study. This is really emergent research. It is fluid. It's a living thing. It is not a fixed piece of research that we produce our report, we toss it out into the public forum, and then tell people they've done the wrong thing, and then it sinks to the bottom of a lot of priorities. What we are hoping for this research is to make it participatory action research. The first stage was identifying there was a problem. The second challenge was to quantify that problem. What is it that's actually going on out there? What are the themes? What types of incidents? What are the frequency? In what environments are they happening? What this is canary in the coal mine. It's actually highlighting with a spotlight what the challenges are at the moment. The cover is very deliberately chosen. Sex work is normally very hidden from people's view. Normally we don't have access to people's stories. We don't know what's going on. This document is intended to be a tool to tell you what's going on at that level. These are people's experiences on a day-to-day basis. The question for us is, are we happy that that circumstance exists? Are we upset, or are we driven to take some action to respond to the information that's in this report? And by that I say individual action. Individuals can take actions, but also a collective action. So this is the tool to start that dialogue, hopefully. 120 sex workers, or 117 sex workers participated in the research report. There was a landlord of a brothel, there was the wife of a security guard, and there was another person who was a witness. So 120 participants in the research study. It covers Mpumalanga and also Gauteng provinces. There are 7 different sites. The main site in Johannesburg is broken down into 11 sub-sites. So we have some very clear diversity in location. We have rural locations, large country towns, we have bushland, we have urban, and we have metro environments. So that we have a good sample to see what's happening, and the themes are quite consistent in those different locations. 57 people participated in a detailed survey activity. They were randomly sampled. So they were sex workers from an area who were invited along to an event. For the 63 witness statements that we took, they were purposively sampled. They were people who we were aware had had an unsatisfactory interaction with SAPS. So very deliberately we wanted to target those to see what had occurred during those incidents. What we have identified is that there are a number of stations that we have labelled as hotspots, or localities that we have labelled as hotspots, where there is consistently occurring events over extended period of time, either involving individual officers or a police station locality. Please don't think this is every police officer. These are individuals within the police service, within SAPS. You know, there are certainly hard-working, law-abiding, human rights compliant policing activities. Today, though, we are focusing on the experiences of these 120 sex workers. What I'd like to do is to really define these sex workers that we're talking about. For the survey, 37 of the sex workers were aged between 26 and 35 years of age. These people are your sisters, your mothers, your brothers, your uncles, your nephews, your grandchildren. Okay, they are members of the community who are using sex work as a livelihood strategy. That doesn't remove them from being general community members. It does focus them as a vulnerable population group, but these are the people living in your communities, and sometimes they're your neighbours. We need to remember that these are everyday people who are having these experiences. For the survey, the age range went from 21 to 65 years of age. 2 of the sex workers were supporting more than 21 dependents each. So you wonder why people in their 60s are doing sex work. It's because there is a need to bring in income to support families and extended families. 21 people is a lot of people to be accepting responsibility for. If you are hurt while you are working, people go straight back to work because they can't afford to seek medical treatment. They can't afford not to be working because there are too many people standing behind them relying on the income that they're bringing in. For the interview statistics, what we found was the age range was from 21 to 50, so it was a younger group. Youngest person we interviewed was 21. So we did not strike any people between 18 and 21 as part of this exercise. For the interviewed sex workers, they supported an average of 4.33 dependents each. So that's in addition to themselves. So nearly 5.5 people relying on the income of every sex worker. Okay. I have grossly gone over my time. I would like to, highlight the types of violations that are recorded in here are quite harrowing. There are incidents of torture, there's very serious assaults, there's people receiving permanent physical disability as a result of everyday policing activities. We have the use of knives, guns, feet, animals, electric shocks, capsicum spray. It's really quite confronting, the level of assaults and violence that's being directed towards sex workers. This is a form of gender-based violence that's occurring, and it's occurring on the front line of the policing operations. It's occurring in front of members of the public, and it's physically damaging members of the public during these operations. What I'd like to do is, there's a lot more information that I'd have and I'd like to talk to people about. My email address is donna@genderjustice.org.za. I am very happy to speak with people about the report, and it can also be accessed in these areas. What I'd like to introduce, though, is the Positive Policing Partnership, which my colleague Nasipo will speak about in a moment. What the sex work sector is doing is taking this report and saying to government and policing, not what are you going to do for us, it's what can we do to support SAPS and the government to deliver a more rights compliant policing framework. This is what's happening now. How do we help shift the behaviours that are happening at that operational level to a more rights compliant and humane form of policing? How do we capacitate SAPS to be able to deliver rights compliant policing? How do we improve the experiences of people at the front line of policing? I have so much more to say, but I will stop now because I have gone to my 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Donna. I think that's, when you're thinking about where do the biggest challenges in policing and human rights lie, it's not usually amongst wealthy people with jobs in good areas and law-abiding citizens who are just going around their everyday business. It usually is at the most vulnerable population groups because that's where it's most hidden, often outside of the sight of people because it can be at night and so forth. And so in many ways, policing organisations, as much as they've got to make sure that police officers who do the right thing are recognised, supported and promoted, they also make sure that the systems are in place to receive information that allow them to identify those police officers who are undermining the public trust, who are weakening community relations. And many times people join the police not because they want to do good things, but because it gives them power and access, and they do bad things. And that's not unique to South Africa. That is a challenge every single police agency everywhere in the world faces. The difference between policing agencies really is, do they have effective systems of accountability so that when police officials are not doing the right thing, that they can identify those officers and take action against them, and if there's systematic challenges, if the training is not accurate, if the resourcing is not there, that they're able to pick up these patterns and respond to them appropriately. Because really, we know from decades of work, what works in democracies is a highly legitimate police service. As I said before, it's about making sure that people want to respect and like the police and trust the police because they see them as trained professionals. Now we're going to go on to, I'll invite Nosipho Vildima, who is from Sweat, and she'll talk a bit about the positive policing setup. Here we go.
Very short. Amazingly short. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nasipo Vidima. I come from an organization called the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force. Our organization's main focus is it's advocating for decriminalization of sex work in South Africa, but we do service provision to sex workers across the country. We have a very large we actually have a national footprint for human rights-based holistic services towards sex workers. And recently we just opened our law center last year. Previously we were working with the Women's Legal Center, and with that approach, it's specifically to work with sex workers around everyday to-day cases, and obviously strategic litigation. And some of that obviously means that it's interdicts against the police. With that said, I'll come back to some of the cases that we've actually come across as the organization. But I want to also introduce Sisonke, which is a sister organization now since last year. Sisonke is the National Sex Workers Movement for sex workers by sex workers. It has a membership of 1,500 sex workers across the country. Please bear in mind that it would have a larger number if sex work was not criminalized. Most sex workers are scared to actually join membership, although they will attend creative spaces, which is an interactive platform that sex workers have every month across the country. So every province has one, every small town has one of those. SWET has a reach of more than 20,000 sex workers per quarter nationally. Yes, which means we do meet with sex workers. We hear from sex workers on a daily basis. We also have a national helpline where sex workers are able to report cases of human rights violation, unlawful arrests, and any other human rights violation that can happen from clients to community to police. Between 2012 to 2017, both the Women's Legal Center and our recent law center have realized that 60% of the cases that we actually have coming from sex workers are cases where sex workers have been raped, tortured, unlawfully arrested, profiled, and all other kinds of human rights violation by police officers. This is not to say that every police officer that comes across a sex worker is a violent police officer, but most of the cases, that's what happens. That's the reality for sex workers on the ground. Last year in August, a group of concerned civil organizations that include Sonke Gender Justice, SWET, Sisonke Asichigi, two expert consultants, one of them sitting here, thank you, Munya, from the COC Netherlands, and sex workers themselves sat down, and we realized that there was a big gap here. Over the past couple of years, we've been trying to engage with police officers and certain police stations on how to work together, but there wasn't enough research. There wasn't a collaborative approach to it. And with seeing this, we formed a positive partnership. Good, this is a lot. Positive policing partnership. Yay, there's a lot of peace. The approach here was to change it from what we had been doing previously, where we'd actually be reactive in most cases where sex workers had been violated by police officers. We would approach that police station and we would ask to actually do sensitization training. The new approach that we're trying to have is one that where we collaborate with police or with police structures, with government structures, with institutions of policing, in order to have a human rights-based approach in dealing with sex workers, rather than us going and doing interdicts. One of the interdicts I'm going to talk about, I would like to mention here, is a 2009 interdict where the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force and Women's Legal Center took the municipal police of Western Cape to court. specifically to argue on the point of loitering. Needless to say that when we approached the court, one of the things that had to be highlighted was that we were not going to be fighting on the criminality of the sex work, but we were going to be actually fighting over the human rights violations that actually happen, which is quite different. We're not saying people are not criminals. We are saying people are human beings that fall under the Constitution and citizenship of South Africa and should be afforded the rights. And we are not saying that when the police officers actually see sex workers doing exactly what they're supposed to be arrested for, they shouldn't arrest them. But what we are saying is that they should realize when they've overstepped their power and are starting to misuse it. With that said, the PPP, I just call it the PPP, aims to work in this way by actually finding entry points into the policing structures, by capacitating sex worker sector itself on how to engage these structures. We also aim and have started through a COC Netherlands MOU with the police, wellness department, some trainings which are focused on human rights and evidence-based, like I said. No longer sensitization. Here we're looking about the human being, from the police officer to the sex worker, to another third party. We are not just saying that the police are bad. We are saying all of us need to come together and actually have a community where humanity exists, which is a step forward to us. And we're hoping that the police themselves will actually come forward as well and work with us. Stacey Lee Monarch, who's our attorney, last year went to one of the trainings. So last year the MOU stated that 300 police officers had to be trained, or authorities within the police structures had to be trained in Durban, Joburg, and Cape Town. She went to the Cape Town one where she presented on human rights. And this is not the first time that we've actually had trainings with police officers. But this time around, because the approach has changed and the police actually are more capacitated to train themselves, it's not just Stacey coming to say, you're a bad cop, but it's police officers that have actually sat down and learned the manual that was produced by the COC and actually know how they're supposed to behave and can disseminate the information to their colleagues. She said that it was a better approach, it was more responsive, it worked better than what we had tried before, where we would actually try to have these sensitization workshops, but we'd end up having the very lowest ranking of police officers coming in to be trained, who not really going to have any influence on how the rest of the police stations act. So, for instance, we have a standard operating procedure that had already existed in Cape Town since 2013. But it has never really been implemented. And the reason for this is that when you bring in low-ranking police officers, they rarely have any influence on how the rest of the department actually functions and how they implement and how they do their processes. So we're hoping that this is a step forward, because we're hoping that because we've entered into the colleges and we're going into the institution itself, we're asking for reception, we're asking for understanding. We're not saying agree that sex work is work. We're not saying agree for decriminalization of sex work here. We're saying just look at a human being as a human being and afford them the rights and the justice that they deserve in the country. That's all.
Okay, thank you very much, Nosipho. We're now going to afford you, as the audience, about 20 minutes to ask questions or raise issues. This is obviously quite a controversial topic for some people, and I think it's a good time to just kind of get a bit of an open discussion going before we get into the next panel and hear from various other organizations that do work related to policing and gender-based work. As you will hear, this is, and you'll see from the report, this is not saying that all police officers do bad things. There's certainly evidence that sex workers themselves have not experienced negative stuff from policing or have come across good police officers. So this is really about saying, if there are these initiatives, how do we, and once again, human rights this is a particular vulnerable group, but police really need to be able to be thinking about a certain level of behavior and conduct when they're in public, no matter who they come across. They might be quite empathetic, the difficulties facing sex workers, but they're going to come across young, unemployed drug addicts. They're going to come across people who are in the country illegally, and a whole range of people. And the whole issue about human rights is that a lot of people say, oh, human rights are only for the criminals. They're not only for the criminals. They're for each and every person in the borders of South Africa. The only time that human rights become limited is when people break the laws of the land, and then the police have a responsibility to act. But when they act, they must always act in such a way that it builds legitimacy, that it's to a certain clear standard, and that the person who, even if they've been arrested by the police and then are brought before the courts and prosecuted, that they don't see the police as the enemy. They see the police as a trained professional who followed very clear standards and upheld their dignity. So that even people who've been criminally convicted don't dislike the police. They still respect the police. But when you have individuals in the police organization who overstep the boundaries, who, because they believe they can get away with things, commit crimes themselves, serious assaults, rapes, take bribes, then they're acting no different from the criminals they're supposed to be engaging with. And then in many people's minds, or people who get exposed to this, start becoming fearful for the police and don't want to work with the police. And that's a situation what we want to change. And I think we're in a good place in South Africa at the moment. There's been a big political shift. We've got a new national commissioner who was appointed at the end of last year. We know that the police already, before then, started to set up new structures, the National Research Unit. And there's a lot of good people in the South African Police Service. And I think we saw in Parliament last year on Tuesday, the leadership presenting about how they want to improve recruitment, improve vetting. So there are definitely moves within the police to try and ensure that police officers are not only held accountable for when they do bad things, but that we can have the best possible men and women in the organization. But even if you have a complete, brilliantly staffed, capacitated, well-trained police organization, if there's no relationships with different communities, if there's no discussion, then it will never be part of a bigger solution and a sustainable solution. And so I think it's important to look at how do we get initiatives that allow different people, constables at station levels, all the way through generals at the national office, to engage in these kinds of research reports, to talk about what it means, so that we're all working towards the same vision of a safe and secure, prosperous South Africa where all our rights are upheld. So, without ado, what we'll do is I'll just take 3 questions or comments at a time, and then I'll ask the panelists to respond, and we'll do that for just under 20 minutes before we move on to the next session. So, are there any questions or comments that people want to make at this point? Just please raise your hand. Just to let you know while you're thinking about whether you want to ask a question or not. This is a live streamed seminar, so you will be given a microphone. Please do speak in the microphone so the online audience can hear. We don't know how many people there are, but they're all around the world and in different parts of South Africa are watching us right now. That also means that if you don't want to be quoted, then don't say anything, because a journalist might be watching and we can't control that. So if you say anything, it could be quoted. Just to let you know, when we have a closed session a bit later, then that'll be Chatham House rules, which means that journalists will have to ask you for permission before they quote you. So I just want to say all that so you're absolutely aware of, before you say something wildly controversial that you didn't mean to say. But if you want to say something controversial, or if you have any challenging questions, please do. We actually set up these engagements because we want to hear from as many different kinds of people as possible. We know that moving forward means we have to have difficult discussions. We have to confront difficult things. We have to open ourselves to criticism. So, are there any criticisms, comments, questions at this point in time? Can I have a show of hands? I have a hand there, and I have a hand there, and the hand there. Okay, so we've got 3. We'll take those 3 and moving on. We'll start you because you're right next to the microphone, and then we'll move on. Hey, please introduce yourself so we all know who's asking the question.
Morning, everyone. I'm Diane Masawe. I've got 2 questions. I think the first is, Donna, you spoke about the report being some of the challenges and some of the cases that came through. For me, what was the most surprising finding for you? And then secondly, did any of the sex workers lay any charges, and what was the outcome, if any did? Thank you.
Thanks very much for that question. I think we have a hand here. That'll be the next easiest. One forward. Thanks, Godfrey.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Munya Gatumba. I'm representing COC Netherlands, which is an LGBT organization, which means lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans. It's based in the Netherlands. My question is to both Sipho and Donna. You did talk about training police, but what I want to know is training alone enough? What else can be done in South Africa? Because going through this report, there are so many bad stories that need change right away. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. And then we have a hand over there.
Thanks. Kathy Albertine from Wits University. The difficult question, I think, when we're dealing with any form of inequality or discrimination, is the problem a few bad apples? So can you solve it by training individuals to be nicer people? Or is the problem more systemic in terms of the institutional culture and ways of policing? And if so, then what are the strategies beyond training?
Okay, thanks for those questions. I'll hand over to our panelists. You can decide amongst you who wants to take the first bite.
Thank you. I guess one of the themes that came through was just the extreme level of violence that was happening. We're not talking about minor injuries. We're talking about people sustaining permanent disabilities. We're talking about sexual assaults and rapes in very aggravated circumstances. I've worked in criminal law for 25 years. I've probably read 10,000 police fact sheets. I struggled on occasion during some of the interviews to not show my reaction to some of the disclosures that came out. They were extremely disturbing and demonstrated very predatory sexual violence being perpetrated without any repercussions, and that was both by members of the public, because the sex workers were not being allowed to report the crimes at the police stations, and it was also about rapes and sexual assaults committed by police that, again, literally people were being thrown out of the police station. They were being threatened with crimes like, I'll charge you with stealing my phone if you wish to proceed to a complaint. So the biggest problem that struck me was these complainants are not getting through the doors. If you can't get through the doors and get your complaint recorded, there's not going to be any change. There's not going to be any awareness. So for me, that was one of the biggest findings, was just the sheer difficulty both the individual is having reporting these crimes, but also the advocacy organisations. I had informal reports of lawyers being told to votsec from the police station. We had legal aid lawyers reporting that they had been threatened that their wives were going to be contacted to tell their wives that they were acting for these dirty mohshes and consorting with prostitutes. It was that level of resistance to any form of support for the sex workers that really struck me. So that leads into the charges laid. I'm not aware of a single successful complaint having been made. I have gone to court, I've seen the behaviour directed at the lawyer at the court, but I am not aware of a single positive finding, even though there's very substantial injuries and significant number of witnesses. They're just not successful. So for me, the complaints systems and processes are not functioning for them. They're not actually effective for this vulnerable population group. So if we can't hear the problems, then we can't look at addressing them. So hopefully that question's answered. I'll go to a few bad apples. I do think that it's an institutional culture issue, but I think also it's about oversight mechanisms and accountability using the existing structures. If we've got a police van with a screaming infant and another screaming young child under 5 in there with the mother who's being detained until a bribe's been paid, it's obvious that people are hearing screaming and children distressed in the back of that police van. If that's sitting in the police station car park, there must be people who are aware. So part of it, I guess, is about strengthening those systems, about reporting and accountability. And I think perhaps there needs to be more oversight at the station level as to what is physically going on in there at any time. Where are those police vehicles? Do they disappear at 4 o'clock every day and they tend to be around the informal brothels and there's some money collection happening there? You know, I think there needs to be a greater tracking and a greater awareness of what's going on, but I think also support for people who do the right thing and who do mentor the right behaviours, recognising that, promoting it, getting those people into training positions, getting them into mentoring positions. There's lots of ways to sort of start to change that culture, but there needs to be a start. Thank you. Is there anything on this?
I think the pretty difficult questions to answer quickly. I mean, the issue of whether it's bad apples or systems is a vexed one in policing. It's usually both. If the organisational culture isn't one that deeply respects a certain level of conduct and the idea of human rights in the organisation generally, then there's more space for officers to not adhere to those standards. And that's the issue about whether it's a structural challenge. So it means how police officers are trained, the kind of people recruited, how they're managed, how they're supervised, when do you get disciplined, when do you get rewarded, all reflects those cultures. And to change that is, I think we've got plenty of examples how that can be done, or how that doesn't work internationally. It's more the exception than the rule, and also changing it so that it stays changed is the challenge. A good example of many years, or over 100 years, of attempting to change policing culture-related corruption was the New York City Police Department. Since the 1900s, there's been a major corruption scandal every 20 years with commissions of inquiry, and then there's been a whole shift to try and fix the leadership and put new policies in places, and there'll be a change, and then within 20 years again, it's changed back. And it's also just the nature of the society as well. I mean, the police officers are coming from the communities. They have a certain way of thinking. There's a lot of demand from the communities themselves. They want to see tough policing, as long as it's not directed to them personally, but they would like to see police being very rough and tough against people they consider as criminals, and that can range from society to, from culture to culture, community to community. So it's an incredibly difficult thing, but I think what you do need is you need to have a start. And in many ways, you've got the vision. It's in documents such as the White Paper and the National Development Plan. And now we need to look at what needs to happen within the SAPs at different levels. At the systems that identify the training needs, the systems for rewarding and recognizing and promoting people, the systems for vetting, the systems for accountability. There's a lot of scope for innovative thinking there. For example, you don't necessarily need, if you want to improve police behavior, you shouldn't necessarily be waiting for somebody to give a formal report necessarily. There should be easy reports. Then you start looking at, okay, we're getting a lot of reports from these police stations. But a lot of it's anonymous because people are scared to come forward. But you're getting the reports. Now you know that there might be a problem there. Then you put dedicated early warning or integrity testing into those places. And it's amazing how much you can do without necessarily, arresting lots of police officials. And also, it's only the negative approach has its own problems. There's a great case study of the Dutch police back in the 1960s where they just decided to punish all those police officials that weren't doing the right thing, and it caused serious problems with the police just stopping to work and massive problems there. So there's no simple solutions, but I think we need to be always working towards a better situation, and it's about talking to different people. It's not something the police can do alone, and it's something that we just need to be aware of, and always and looking at the policies in place and saying how do we together make these policies a reality, and what are the systems and technicalities that have to be in place to be there? Are they there? No easy task, but something that I know many of us in this room are dedicated to. Are there any other questions or comments at this stage? There will be a later. Okay, there's a hand there, another hand there, another hand there. Okay, so we've got three. Great. Okay, just please introduce yourself before asking the question.
Hope it's still morning. My name is Dumisani. I'm a practitioner and I work with communities and mostly men. When we engage on just human rights, I think we also talk to men about sex work and the need to decriminalize sex work in our country. And of course, as you may know, it sparks a lot of debates and that. I often say my favorite frame that we are all sex workers. You exchange sex for something, for marriage, for, you know. So I know the PPP, as she said it, is aimed at showing us another level of engagement. And yes, it might unblock the tensions or the gaps that we are having, you know, on operational policing. But I do think that we should have an ongoing conversation of getting a model that will decriminalize sex work in our country. If things are changing politically, I think it's an opportunity to enhance that discussion. I understand this forum doesn't want to go there, but I think it's something that we should not let go as we engage. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to acknowledge the passion in this room and Donna for introducing the research. So I'm just going to make one comment of support, and then, if you may allow me to just throw a curveball into the equation. But I'm from the Department of Police Practice at UNISA, and I've been working with organized crime and human trafficking and in the sex trade for the last 16 years. I've walked a very personal road with many sex workers over the last 16 years. And I think this one first, a challenge to the ISS. Over the last 16 years, and obviously now with the research that I've completed over the last 5 years, also with 120 people working with human trafficking, is that there are countless murders being committed, sex workers being murdered, dockets not being opened. And I think that is, to me, a concern, and it's not being addressed. Women being thrown down the shafts of mines, police officials complicit in the murder, and even more brutal forms of abuse. So I think I want to ventilate that. The second one, that's maybe what the ISS can do, is to check and investigate whether we cannot start using our new torture legislation. Because we've had a new torture legislation, Act 13 of 2013, which I think we need to start using to prosecute police officials. And then, if I may, to throw the curveball into the equation, testifying in cases of human trafficking, I want to be unequivocal, and I know this is a contentious debate, that sex work as we frame it and human trafficking are not as disparate as many make it out to believe. I think we cannot conflate the two. But I think there are lived realities in our communities, and there's, you know, we see the public violence. When you hear these cases in court, when you consult with these victims, you realize how many sex workers are not being identified as victims of human trafficking. So what I want to say is that we cannot separate the two. Yes, you cannot conflate it, but we need to realize that the two are seamlessly interweave in many aspects. So
another hand just there, and then we'll wrap this session up after we have some responses. I think there's a hand. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, Tusi. I'm a professor at Cal Western Law School in San Diego. So during both of your remarks, you commented on the fact that sex work is not decriminalized, and you're not stating that the police shouldn't enforce sex work. I guess I wanted to get your thoughts in terms of deprioritizing sex work, because, as was mentioned earlier, there's a high violent crime rate in South Africa. Resources, police often authority.
Another opportunity at the end of the seminar, just to get some responses, and then we'll
touch on the decrim issue. If it's an issue, it's not an issue. It will promote anything and make sex work a new profession for everybody else. But because when we're talking about policing, it will make a cut in the resources that are spent policing sex workers. It will make a provision for sex workers to be able to actually report what Marcel at the back has just talked about, which is human trafficking. We actually have an example of a case where sex workers came forward because they had built a relationship with certain police stations in Durban. Where the doctor case that went around in Durban a few years back, the whole syndicate with the doctor and his wife, that was reported by Sweat. Because sex workers had accessed the space that was safe, that had police come into the space because there was a trusting relationship between the provincial coordinator and the police stations around the area. So sex workers, when given a trusting relationship where they know they actually not going to be criminalized further or victimized further, from trafficking to murders to that happens or is assumed to happen where sex work is happening. It will also make safer working environments because it means sex workers can mobilize and unify and actually space where the murder rate will actually reduce, violence will reduce. By police officers, by their intimate partners, by the community, by people that are posing as clients. You will also have your brothels will stop operating under false pretenses. They will actually fall under the labor regulations and labor laws, which means that there will be better structures for sex workers and the police officers to monitor what happens and what is going on. Instead of them driving around all night, policing and demanding bribes, they will actually have times where they can go and check the establishment, check for human trafficking, check for illegal activities. I want to make an example of a woman that has recently passed away around here in Gauteng. She was a sex worker where police actually did not do anything. So in October last year, we received a report of a sex worker who was getting beaten up by a supposed partner who also happened to know that she was a sex worker and also happens to be demanding money from her. And one of the organizations, when they heard about this is intimate partner violence. When they heard about this, they went to the police station. And because the police officers at the police station knew that this woman was a sex worker, would not open the case, even though they had a peer educator who was accompanying them, which is a service provider, which is somebody that they should actually allow into the space as well, because they were assisting. They were chased away. And that was October. November, end of November, the report came in. Babalwa had passed away. And the partner was arrested, but there wasn't enough evidence. And till this day, I'm saying if they had arrested the guy on that spot when there was a report that she was being beaten up, she would be alive. Donna will elaborate more on the kind of cases she's come across of murder as well.
Donna, we've got to end now, so not to tell you.
Well, just in relation to, again, that reporting of crime, unfortunately the same challenges exist when it comes to murdered sex workers. Not far from here, at a place called Bush in Pretoria, a sex worker called Queen Keketso was murdered in November 2015. Despite the best efforts of all the sex workers who wanted to speak to the police to give evidence about the last client she was seen with, who they'd seen around, what their thoughts were, they were threatened with arrest if they didn't stop trying to tell their stories to the police. Now, Queen Keketso was somebody's sister, she was somebody's daughter. That murder is not investigated. Just one quick quote. Again, in the Gauteng area, 2 dead sex workers have been found in close proximity to one another, where the bodies were found. Same object inserted internally into them. One of the sex workers who works in that area, Zandili, she's 41. She supports herself and a son from her sex work. This is her quote. "The 2 dead ladies had sticks inside their vaginas, like this police officer likes to make the sex workers do. I'm scared this police officer is the person killing sex workers. I told them about the police officer using these sticks on sex workers, and I thought he was involved in the murders. The police said I might be lying, and it was not him. They refused to take a statement from me. That is so common. That is what all of the people are indicating when they go to the police station. They are either threatened with arrest or they are chased away. So there's 3 sex worker murders in a close proximity to where we are. No investigation, no closure for the families. This is the sort of challenge that the services are having with this rights compliant policing. These people's lives deserve investigation, as does their death.
Okay, and one of the issues about structure is that when you have a measurement system that tells the police that if the numbers of crimes they record is going down, they're doing a good job, and when the numbers of crimes they record is going up, they're doing a bad job, then you immediately have a problem. They stop recording crime, so it makes it look like they're doing a good job. Our crime statistics should stop being a measure of police performance and be only a measure of the crime challenge that the police have to face. So that when stations start recording all the crimes that are being reported to them, they are given the adequate resources they can use to respond to those crimes. At the moment, personally, we get so many complaints regularly of people going to police stations all over the place where police officers don't want to open cases because it makes their stats look bad. So the next time you see, and we've seen this on the National Victims of Crime Survey, that the numbers of proportion of people who say they've been victims of sexual assault, rape, and are willing to report that crime to the police has dropped by 31% since 2011. So when we see the crime stats coming out and you see reductions in the numbers of rape cases and the sexual assault cases, that's not an indicator of women being safer in our society. That's an indicator of fewer victims reporting these cases to the police, or fewer cases being recorded by the police. So we really need to think systemically around different ways of measuring police performance. A much better measure would be how safe do people feel in each precinct? How do they feel about the police? What is their being direct experience of police services? That's what the police can control and should be measured on. When you're measuring crime stats, that's not a police measure of performance. That's just an incident of criminality. On that issue, we need to... Yeah.
So, excuse me, Mary, I forgot to answer. We forgot to answer the professor's question.
Which question? Okay.
Professor. I'm sorry, I just realised we forgot to address your question. We do have some statistics from the survey results, and that was about people who had been arrested for sex work. 62% had been arrested before. The average number of arrests per person was 4 times, so that police resources tied up in the policing of sex work. The average time spent in custody per arrest was 40 hours. So each person spent an average of 160 hours in police custody. So that's using police resources for the arrest process, for the custody processes. But the outcomes, the number of people who received a fine at court, 12%. So we've had 180 days of custody, and we've got a court result of 12%. 53% got a fine, which they could have been issued at the side of the road. And 31% of those who were arrested and detained never went to a police station, never went to a courthouse, never received a fine. That's where you find the sexual assaults, the physical assaults, the picking and dropping people up miles away from where they were picked up. So it is a huge drain on police resources for what effectively quite often results in a fine or no outcome. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Could I ask the next panelists to come to the front, please? Do we have Lieutenant Colonel Toko Mota, Dr. Connie Kanaka from SANAC? I know we've got Commissioner Botha. Do you have Marita Ground from Gauteng Department of Community Safety and Dr. Simon Howell from APCOF? If those people, if they were here, can just come to the front, please. Thank you. Okay. 2 out of 5. Could I ask Commissioner Botha, would you mind coming up and starting the second? Over here, please. Thanks. Yeah, I think you've got a presentation, so if you're shown to you. you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Kenneth. Thank you. Well, good morning, and thank you, Kenneth. Before I start my presentation, I just wanted to foreground what I'm going to say by saying a few things. As we gather today, we should really be grateful and thankful of what happened yesterday as a Dimeni and the outcome and what former Deputy Justice Musareke did for this country. So we should, as we do this, I mean, this work now and launching this report, always bear in mind the efficacy of having strong institutions and not strong men. Having have said that, I also want to, as we talk about this morning, and as I do the presentation, it's going to be short, to think about the following, about impunity, to think about religion and what that religion does in this context, but also to think about culture, what culture does, what culture says in this context, but also think about poverty, what poverty does in this context, but think about class, think about race, think about gender. Having have said that, Gareth, I want us to move, other than just to say that CGE is a Chapter 9 institution created by an Act of Parliament. We do research, we do education, litigation. Remember I spoke about strong institutions. I also want to appeal that in all the 9 provinces, you have offices of the Commission for Gender Equality. Now, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, these institutions that were created can only be strong if we make them strong. I just want to say that this morning, please let's ensure that we make use of these institutions. And the public protector, former public protector, Advocate Tuli Madonsela, had shown how efficient these institutions can be if they're used properly. But also, while we're doing this, to think about how do we use our constitution, a powerful, potent weapon that we have. Having have said that, I also want to move, Gareth, to whoever assists me, to our recommendations after talking about what the CG is, so that this is going to help. Thank you. I thought you would be sympathetic to the disabled, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. That would be nice, Gareth, and there would be some, if you play lotto, if you win lotto, so something for you.
Can we go further?
Yeah. This is the beauty of but also as I go on my presentation, also have in mind what happens daily to gays, lesbians, bisexual, transgender. What happens to people living with albinism? Think about all of this every day. That when you have sex workers, it could be someone who is going to be killed for purely and simply being a woman. Someone's going to be killed for being poor. And as Dimeni is a classical example of happens. Someone may be killed for being gay, for being lesbian. So all of these things, I want us, them to form part of these discussions. Now, one of the things that I wanted us to say is, I mean, give the contextual background that sex work in South Africa forms part of the vulnerable. I think Kenneth spoke about this, about the vulnerability of being a sex worker, because it's then criminalized. But also, I mean, sex workers in South Africa, they form part of a vulnerable class by the nature of their work and subjected to, subjected to exploitation, to abuse, to assault on a daily basis, and their dignity, right? Sex workers are denied the right to dignity. Which are, when you look at our constitution, that are basic to us for every other individual in this country. The other than the background is that the CGE had done an investigation into sex work, into what are the problems after SWED had approached the CGE, or together with the legal center, and then Commission for Gender Equality got involved and did a report which I want to go straight to it about what were the recommendations, Gareth. Yeah, if you could. Yeah, I want us, if you move on, just go to because of in the absence of no, let's go back. That was too soon for conclusion. Let's go back. Yeah, right. Now this is thanks, Gareth. I'm not sure whether you were going to the conclusion because you want me to stop, which would negate your support for the disability sector. The Women's Legal Center I spoke about had lodged a complaint with the Commission on behalf of the sex workers. SWED. This was regarding the dire need of the decriminalization of sex work and in turn the release of the report by the Law Commission. Now, part of the segment of the complainant concerned the specific allegations on gross violation of human rights on the part of 2 sex workers against the SAPS. Now, the CGE conducted an in-depth investigation which included, sourcing information from both parties to the complainant. The CGE found that this is the crux of what the CGE had found, that the South African police are utilizing municipal bylaws to unlawfully arrest and detain sex workers. Now, step back for a moment. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about impunity. That you do this, you know that you are not only acting illegal, but you know that you would not be, nothing will happen to you. This is what, in simple terms, what impunity means, that I can literally get away with murder. Okay, yeah, let's move on. Right. Now, in the current antagonistic legal framework, the Commission is limited in its ambit to provide solution to the current violation of sex workers' rights. What we can do and what we do is, as I said, we do litigation, take reports, liaise with Parliament. But then, and part of what we are doing now, the current crop of commissioners, is also looking at the CG Act to say, how do we make sure that the same that the public protector did. How do we make sure that the law or the Act, the CG Act, has in fact teeth that which we are able to bite, not only creating report, it's to ensure that these reports are acted on. Yeah. Now, sorry. Now, these are what did the CGE recommend? Very important. Firstly, we thought that the SAPS to convene sex work sensitization workshop with the assistance from the NGOs. Now, I spoke about how, look, if you go to the police station, you're a sex work, you find that there is already a conducive environment that says there is something inherently wrong about what you are doing. Now, what does that mean? That means that, and Gareth, you spoke about, you don't have policemen and women who are falling from the sky. They operate within a peculiar context. And what is that context? It's a context within the social norms that in fact makes it possible to violate, because then you would be asked inappropriate questions. And I'll give an example where an individual will be asked, "Mare luena king to loosely translated, but and I can't say it, word for it in English, but it says the deeper meaning is that there's something inherently wrong. It's sin what you're doing. It's ungodly. It's un-African. Which means, therefore, as a policeman or woman, I can then violate your right because already I've created an environment, or I operate within an environment that, in fact, supports. An environment that says it's okay. In the same way, in the same vein that, if you go to a police station in the township, you'd find a policeman or woman asking a woman who identifies herself as lesbian. A question would be, you can't be into a lesbian. That's when you find when a lesbian is raped, there are these social norms that I want to teach you. There's something wrong about you. I want to teach you what it means to be a woman. But also, in the same context, if you are commercial sex work, you are then asked that. But you know what? A police would actually say that. You see, there is real work. Why can't you do this? Because then, in the communities where they come from, you would find people asking questions like, who do you allow your girl child to be a commercial sex worker? Already the question presupposes, or the question says that there is fundamental, inherent, something evil wrong. Remember I said, think about religion, think about culture, think about poverty, think about class, about religion. All of these things, they are in fact, they create a fertile ground for non-action or for impunity. Okay. I thought you'd treat me differently, but it's all right. Okay. Well, one of the things that the Commission has done is that, if you look at 4.1, where criminalization of sex work is in fact contrary to international laws that South Africa is party of. If you look at CEDAW, if you look at Beijing Platform of Action, if you look at the Africa Charter on Human and People's Rights, all of these things, they in fact are saying that as South Africans, South African government has acceded, has signed. You would actually think that police, men and women, would understand. But I want to argue this morning that they can't even internalize these pieces of legislation, because communities where they come from, these legislation, they mean nothing. They mean bogoro, dololo, nothing. For them it's our king in Beijing, our king in CEDAW, king, women, people. These are Eurocentric, un-African. In fact, you operate from a disadvantage point if you are an activist or you are a Chapter 9. When you raise these questions of, look, you are in fact breaking the law. You'd be asked that, but look, whose law is this? People are, as we speak now in South Africa, there are sections of our communities that are even asking or questioning whose constitution is it about? Whose interest does it serve, this constitution? As I end, and I thought this presentation, I hope that it would be made available to. I want to end by saying that police, men and women, not only have a duty to respect the Constitution, that these international instruments I spoke about, but for as long as they know that they operate in a society that in fact gives them the right to act the way that they act, we will not stop it. But the elephant in the room is, what do we do as individuals here? Because we come from these communities. It's all very well to lambast, to blame police, and rightly and correctly so. But the question that all of us must always ask ourselves, what am I doing in my own space? What am I doing where I am? What am I doing to my neighbor? What am I doing? Where the trade union movement in all of this? Where are the churches in all of this? So all of us have a responsibility. All of us, a responsibility not only to speak truth to power, but also to ask ourselves that if I look the other way, am I not creating an environment that supports, an environment that makes all of us to actually look the other way, or to shrug our shoulders and say, but they deserve it as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Botha from the Commission for Gender Equality. Do we have Lieutenant Colonel Tokomata? Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for that very passionate and interesting input. I'm sorry I had to treat you exactly the same as everybody else. Thank you very much, Lieutenant Colonel. Really appreciate it. Go ahead. Okay.
I'm just going to speak to my notes. Greetings to everyone.
In fact, my name is not Lieutenant Colonel Mota. I am Colonel Onika Twaile from the very same office. I will just speak to my notes and my presentation. My role is primarily just to speak to the relationship that the SAPS have entered into with COC Netherlands. And I've been listening to all the speakers and all the comments that have been made around policing and the role that the police is playing. Yes, indeed, police officers are an extension of a broader society. The same men and women in blue, they actually emanate from all these communities. And it actually makes me think as I'm sitting here, especially listening to the last speaker before myself, to say if somebody leaves their household and go to work clothed in blue uniform, who and what do they represent? Because that needs to make us think. You don't lose your identity simply because you are wearing a blue uniform. You don't forget about your ideals and your values simply because you are clothed in blue uniform. A person will constitute who they are even in the workspace that they are operating in. So each time you come across all these gruesome reports that we come across, we need to always be reminded that these are the same elements of the same communities that everybody is complaining around. So the big question for me says, as a South African citizen, what is my role? What is my contribution? Over and above, what am I being tasked to do? A constitutional right on all of us about upholding the rights of human beings, including the police themselves. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. South African Police Service has been observant of all these outcry from the various stakeholders, the different non-governmental organization, advocacy group, and all the civil society organizations. And it has been our responsibility to look inwardly and say, over and above what is happening outside the context of SAPS, what is the role that a component, employee health and wellness, is to play in turning around some of these perceptions. One of our key responsibilities is to ensure that we maintain the broader health and wellness of South African police, men and women. Now, we entered into a partnership with COC Netherlands, and I must give a strong acknowledgement to Mr. Munya Katumba. He is in this room, in our midst. And had he not been persistent in pushing the values of the organization that he's coming from, in making sure that he pushes all the frontiers within SAPS and makes sure that there's a level of hearing, starting from the bottom, moving upwardly. It took him, of course, together with a proportion within the SAPS, a year just to have an acknowledgement in terms of the in-principle partnership. You can imagine if somebody says, if one letter has to be signed within a year, what actually takes whatever level to embark on such a long process. SAPS cannot be excluded from your normal processes within government. We observe all the protocols. We make sure that we adhere to the laws and all the bylaws that we have been speaking about. And we make sure that we protect even the rights of the same employees that SAPS is employing over and above the rules of law that all the citizens' human rights must be taken into account. Because police members are also South African citizens. So we made sure that we cross all the T's, we dot all the I's. It was a long and painful process, but in the end it paid off. In that 1 year, through his persuasion, we managed to get the National Commissioner at that time, or let me rather say the Office of the National Commissioner at that time, to give us an in-principle approval to enter into discussions with COC Netherlands. Now, it was at that time when we started with series of discussions. There were a lot of consultative meetings. There were a lot of roundtable dialogues, looking inwardly and outwardly with regards to what the SAPS stands for in upholding the Constitution versus what is expected of our role as an organization to the communities. And it was around that time when there was an indication that whilst we are waiting for the MOU, which officiate our interaction or the partnership with COC, that we continue with operational work. That's where we started engaging other stakeholders within SAPS, our legal department, the division that is responsible for development and training of the employees, the division that is actually responsible for your visible policing outside, because we've got all those different divisions within the SAPS. And we never stopped to say we don't have a formal approval, and we continued with all those processes whilst awaiting the final vetting and the approval of the MOU. That was 2015. In 2016, there were other administrative processes, the to and fro's of getting the MOU vetted, and also starting with some operational engagements. And it was at that stage where a formal needs assessment process was embarked upon. 3 provinces with a specific target of the metropolitan areas were sampled: Gauteng, Western Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal. That's where we started looking at collecting data. Remember, the whole process was with an intention of developing a training and a sensitization manual to empower our police officers. And in all those processes, the leadership of SAPS was involved. There were a number of generals that were interviewed. There were a number of commanders that were interviewed, both at the headquarters, provincial headquarters, as well as some of the cluster commanders. There were a number of interviews that were conducted in that space. But by and large, focusing at the operative space, meaning the police officers who are responsible for operational work. And whilst all that was done, there was a group that was targeted to train the trainers. We did the train the trainer on the same manual that was approved. And following that, we worked on a session of rolling out the manual. Again, we went back to the very same provinces where needs assessment were conducted to test the training manual. And it was in that space where 8 training sessions were conducted, 2 in Gauteng, 1 in KwaZulu-Natal, and 1 in the Western Cape. Approximately 400 operational police officers were exposed to the contents of the manual. And I must say proudly so that it was in that space where we received a signed and endorsed MOU that is lasting us for 5 years, or for the duration of 5 years, from the Office of the National Commissioner. That was in 2017. So as I'm speaking here, I'm saying SAPS have an official relationship with COC Netherlands, of course, without overlooking our local NGOs. So there's quite a number of organizations that we're working with them, of course, through that formal approval partnership. These organizations are linked to COC. It's UPCOF, Out Wellbeing, SWEAT, HIV TB Triangle Project, Durban LGBTI Center, CSVR, amongst others. So I must say, ladies and gentlemen, that there's just those simple and baby steps that the SAPS is embarking on I'm not standing here and saying to you that all the problems that have been highlighted here are finished or will be ended, but I must say that there's an initiative within the organization that proves that SAPS is starting to do a lot inside. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Colonel. Really appreciate hearing from the South African Police Service and that there are such initiatives taking place. And there indeed shows that there are practical things happening and that things there are things we can build upon. So it's good that this is a 5-year project. It looks like it can be rolled out. Very interesting to assess the training and see how it impacts on police behavior and how they see their work going forward. Very positive and encouraging input. Thanks so much. Can I just check, do we have Dr. Connie Kanaka here? Okay, I just wanted to check that I'm not overlooking her. When I go to our next speaker, who will be Miss Marita Ground, ex-colleague of mine. I also used to work at the Gauteng Department of Community Safety. Thanks so much for coming here today, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Good morning or good afternoon, whichever is applicable at this time. Gareth, you're a bit unfair. It's difficult to speak after Commissioner Botha, because they always just grasp the whole audience. And then as oversight, I now have to speak directly after SAPS. So I'm really between a rock and a hard place at the moment. Colleagues, we are talking about building positive policing partnership. I think when Nosipho was talking, she was saying, oh, all these P's. And I was thinking if really all these P's can come together. I know that we're not talking about decriminalization of sex workers now, but would we have the need for this discussion if it was decriminalized? When I looked at the acts of South Africa, no act excludes sex workers. Your Sexual Offences Act is very clear. So why should South Africa still grapple with a human right of a sex worker? What we're committing, as I was listening to all the other speakers, can you hear me? Can I? Okay, recording. Okay. As I was listening to all the previous speakers, I thought I would like to respond to some of the things as we're talking. Within our department, in my directorate, we do what we call docket audits of closed cases for gender-based violence. I want to make the commitment here, and Gareth, you will get a report at the end of the next financial year, that we are going to ask for closed docket audits on sex workers. Because clearly sex workers do go to police stations. So clearly there must be dockets. What we do is, if the dockets are closed, then we make sure that we review it together with the police and with NPA. So that is a commitment, and you'll get feedback. We also look under the unit prevention. We always ring-fence cases. So I'm going to please plead with Sweat and everybody else. If you have matters, please contact me so that we can make it part of the 550 ring-fence cases that we report on. What happens with these ring-fence cases is we try to give complete holistic services, from the criminal justice services to therapeutic services, to make sure, or with a hope, that conviction and trial processes will go better. In the closed dockets, we're going to look at whether there was J88s done for sex workers. We're going to look at whether statements was done, and whether the second right to give a statement has been allowed to the victim. Having said all of this, we should never weaken the spirit of South African police. I am working with FCS in Gauteng. We had 2 different occasions where we had to look at best practices. And let me tell you, we've got committed police. We have police officers that are willing to go and sleep on a dumping site to make sure they get a serial killer. It's not just all gloom and dark. I would like, if it's possible, I know researchers can't give us the names of those that you interview due to ethical considerations, but is it possible that we can get the police stations within Gauteng? Because then we know we can just target those police stations from an oversight view. In South Africa, we talk a lot about vulnerable groups, which is about women and children. Mainly, so they are part of the vulnerable groups. From presidential speeches to politicians on the ground, we always talk about protecting the rights of women. And I am just saying to you plainly that every woman, irrespective of being a judge, a social worker, a cleaner, or a sex worker, we have the right to being treated correctly. I hear everything that SAPS is going to do. However, in 2008, a National Instruction 3 of 2008, please go read up on it. It gives a clear mandate for SAPS to deal with victims of sexual violence. So as far as 2008, we had this national instruction. A quote from it is, which this instruction will ensure the provision of adequate and active protection to all victims of sexual violence. I kind of rest my case with that. Just yesterday we had a meeting, and being the activist that I think all of us are in this room, I have a huge issue, and I don't know if you will see it as a link with this, but it is about the disaggregation of our criminal stats. Within assaults and grievous bodily harm lies your sex workers. Lies, and how do we break it down if SAPS is not giving us those stats? Within murders and attempted murders lies the murder of sex workers, lies the attempted suicide that has left women bruised, not just emotionally, but on the body. You know what, colleagues, and Commissioner Botha said this, it's about you and me, civil society. It's about Chapter 9, that is, including the Human Rights Council. It's about all government departments. It's about us as women to make sure that we allow women the rights that they deserve. I requested something yesterday, so Gareth, expect me to knock on your door. The head of our department just yesterday, Mariska, she said to me, Marita, if you want to really bite this big bull by the head, you can give a presentation to MEC and later EXCO legislature of Gauteng. We've got to get or start somewhere in South Africa with a disaggregation of stats, so that you and me that are committed to ensure that women, I'm not going to say sex workers, because sex workers is inherent to women, gets the rights that they need. This is not a academic or a theoretical statement that I've made to you, but it's simply coming from an activist that believe that we really have to look at this triple P and let's make it work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marita. She's the director of Ikaila Temba Victim Empowerment Center, run by the Department of Community Safety in Gauteng. Another passionate speaker and somebody who's been really well active in this field for a long time. Okay, our last speaker before we open up for the last round of questions and discussion is the research director of the African Police Civilian Oversight Forum, who's done a lot of really amazing work across Africa on policing and police accountability. Dr. Simon Howell, I welcome you to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I essentially want to present a sort of structural overview of a range of issues that focus essentially on the relationship that police have with the communities in which they operate. And with specific reference, obviously, to vulnerable populations. And I mean that in the broader sense of the term, so including women, children, sex workers, drug users, etc. I think, from a structural perspective, that this relationship between law enforcement and perhaps in South Africa between law enforcement and society as a whole is one of antagonism, in which the parties, so to speak, are placed in confrontation with one another, the result of which is violence, frankly. Law enforcement have been positioned as the face of government in many places, and have, as a result, ended up responding to a lot of different issues that they're not trained nor skilled to do. So in many communities, law enforcement operate as paramedics and as medical officers and as social workers and as many other things. And when you ask of an organization to do this type of work they're not trained to do, the result often is difficulty. Law enforcement in South Africa has obviously been plagued by inadequate resources of various types. And one of the key issues today is to figure out how the resources they have can be used more effectively and efficiently. There's insufficient training, especially when it comes to dealing with vulnerable populations. As I'll sort of highlight in a bit, the vulnerable populations often have complex dynamics that SAPS officers are just not trained to deal with, nor are the SAPS systems designed to deal with. So if you think about transgender people that are arrested, how does SAPS deal with them in terms of custody and holding cells? A big issue that the police often highlight is that they don't have the space in many police stations to designate or dedicate a single cell to individual people. So what do they do with those people? And the result is that because of the hierarchy of SAPS and sort of the linear structure, they don't really have the space to make the decisions themselves. And as a result, they follow orders. And it's those orders that create violence often. There's also, as mentioned, there's a lot of performance pressure, I think, in SAPS to meet stats or to create stats so as that they can be presented because, as Gareth mentioned, crime is understood as a statistical, quantitative thing in this country where success is the higher the number, the more success we've had. Yet, often it begs the question, if the drug stats, for instance, keep going up, is this an indicator of successful policing or is it an indicator of successful drug dealing? There's often more drugs. There's also, there's operational limitations that SAPS frequently encounter that I don't think are often recognized. What are they trained to do and what do they do? And what are they supposed to do? And as a result, there's a misunderstood purpose. But on the other hand, there's this conflict generates out of the vulnerable populations being policed in a manner that is often heavy-handed, violent, and as spoken to here, causes all sorts of harm. Vulnerable populations are necessarily marginalized, whether it be socially, politically, economically, and therefore have sort of a stigma attached to them, which, as again said before, is translated when police officers come from communities and put on a blue uniform, and as a result, even though they do that, they don't stop having or believing the things they believe, and that stigma translates into a type of policing which can be very violent. There's also a lot of interpersonal violence in marginalized groups, and they have complex narratives, and they're legally excluded. Decriminalization has been mentioned here. So it's at these sorts of this interface that this type of violence emerges. And it's not just with sex work. It's with drugs, LGBTIQ issues. There's a range of them. And there's a pattern that emerges. And that pattern is violence becomes the means of dealing with the inability to know what to do. And I think that is where SAPS and society needs to work towards building relationships that are effective at educating people. It's not just about back to basics. It's about how do we understand each other and how do we move beyond this antagonistic relationship between law enforcement and society. It's also spoken to many cops who find it difficult to want to police well, because society, they feel that society hates them, and they're unhappy. And, you know, I mean, you see it, I see it often that people will go and they will be antagonistic and fight with the police on non-existent issues. And as a result, the police are demotivated. And I think that can be cashed out in the stats. So sort of looking at it a different way, there's a lot of key issues here that are shared. I mean, so in terms of law enforcement, there's the resources, and these are structural. There's a staffing, and there's performance issues. I mean, performance management in SAPS is one of the crucial areas I think that needs to change really quickly. A lot of bad policing is generative of the performance metrics. If you are told you have to arrest a certain amount of people in order to make the stats, you will go out and arrest them. And the reason you go out to arrest them is because police officers are not well paid and you want to get promotion so as you can feed your family. So, you know, there's that pressure within SAPS as well, which is pushing towards numeric types of arrests, and especially, you know, with petty offences. There's also a training issue. As mentioned, you know, they've sort of nearly doubled their membership, and as a result, there's a lot of issues about how do we train the people we've taken in to do something or to be police officers in the ontological sense. But what's important for me is that if you look at the third block, there's a shared issue here. And it's this issue, the sharing of vulnerability, essentially, that is the basis for building more effective relationships. Both in terms of law enforcement and vulnerable population, there's a lot of scapegoating going on. The police are blamed for a lot of governmental ills. They're representative of government, in the same way that sex workers and police and drug users are blamed for a lot of crimes that they don't commit. But it's easy to blame them because they're visible and they're marginalized, so they don't really have a voice. There's a lot of concern around trauma. You know, both police officers and marginalized people have experienced a lot of trauma, and as a result need sufficient forms of counseling to deal with that. And often that, you know, at a personal level, I think often that type of trauma is cashed out through violence. The problem, of course, is when, in terms of the police, they have a gun as well, and the authority to commit types of violence which are often go without punishment. So there's essentially a shared issue here that can be dealt with effectively if we can think of them as shared, or as a relationship. So sort of finding commonality, I think, is key to understanding how to move beyond this. And I think it's an area for research, which I'll talk about in a second. You know, in terms of law enforcement, there needs to be a recognition of vulnerability. There needs to be a recognition that there are key populations or vulnerable populations within society, and that they may not need to be treated differently, but there needs to be recognition that there needs to be some type of intervention. There's also, I mean, you know, a question around resources which remains, is what does SAPS as an organization do to ensure that it can encounter and deal with vulnerable populations in a manner that is just and equal? Because at present, the structures don't allow for that. And I mean, an obvious example is holding cells. How do you create the spaces where people of different genders, different classes can be held together? And there's also, of course, the question of how do you enforce the law within the parameters of the law? One of SAPS's biggest issues is litigation. And the reason they litigate it so often is because they don't sit within the law. So, you know, encouraging and explaining that to officers in a manner that engenders better policing is crucial. From a vulnerable population, there's also, I mean, there needs to be a recognition of purpose and place. In terms of sex work, it is illegal, unfortunately. And we must remember that the police enforce the law. They don't create or make the law. So when the mandate is to enforce the law, that's unfortunately what they have to do. And blaming the police for that is not really placing blame in the right place. It's the courts who need to change the law. So on that basis, we need to form partnerships, working relationships, and so on. So last slide, guys. So essentially in terms of research and moving forward, there's a lot of commonality that can exist or does exist, and that can be the basis for further research and relationships and projects. Sex workers and marginalized populations are of great utility in terms of operations, in terms of information gathering, and so on, and that is a basis for working relationships. There can be strategic partnerships such as the COC and SAPS, which has proved to be very fruitful. There needs to be organizational dialogue, such as this, so we can talk to one another. Harm reduction is again important in sense in the broader sense, not just for drugs, but how do we create systems that reduce the harm that policing affects to society? And finally, sort of re-inclusion and protection of people, all based, obviously, on the constitutional mandate for accountability, human rights, and oversight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's tough having to be such a dictatorial chairperson so close to Human Rights Day. Okay, for the next 10 or 15 minutes, we'll just open the floor if there's any questions or comments you want to make in response to what you've heard here this morning. And I think there's been some very valuable and a wide range of different perspectives. So we've got institutions like the Commission of Gender Equality. We've got oversight structures and victim support centres from the Department of Community Safety in Gauteng. And we've got people who are looking at this from different perspectives. So it's really, I think what we've heard is that there's various ways in which we can be engaging. But we can't continue the way things are. We want to improve things, not only for vulnerable groups, but for the police and for all of us. An interesting connection just about on the arrest rates, because, I mean, just last Friday, I had a flying squad officer, I was talking to him, and he's complaining to me about these arrest targets they have to reach. And the problem is that they want to go after serious criminals, but that takes more time, and it's more difficult to make established arrests. So they're actually directing resources away from really dangerous criminals and arresting petty people so they can make their quotas, so that they don't get pressure and they can meet their performance targets. Now, what happens often is that those arrests are not necessarily based on a reasonable suspicion that can be proved in court. So if you look at this massive increase in the amount being paid out by the police after the courts have found that an arrest isn't supported lawfully, I think it's gone up 29% just in the last 2 financial years, 330 odd million rand paid out last year. So you can see that a performance measure is forcing police to take more action against people who probably don't deserve it, redirecting sources away from serious criminals and costing the police massive amount of money in payouts because it can't always be done legally. So I agree with Simon that, I mean, one of the early interventions that has to be made at a senior management level in the police is to relook at each of these targets. And immediately scrap them if they can see any way that this is actually undermining the objective of the police and causing problems in the police. Rather than not have a target. And in fact, many police agencies internationally are reducing the numbers of targets quantifiably and moving the different kinds of measures, because policing is not just a scientific statistical set of performances. It's a craft. It's about people who have experience, how to engage with each other. And that's going to constantly be changing in different communities in different ways. And so if you look at the principle of policing and democracy is trust and legitimacy. Everything a police officer should be doing is building trust and legitimacy in the communities that they're working, because then they're better likely to get the information against the real criminals, able to help people, their lives will be easier and they'll be safer as well. And there'll be less stress on both their sides and the sides of the communities they're policing. But those principles are often undermined by something simple as you've got to go out and make 10 arrests today. And you're going to arrest if you can't go after this more serious, difficult to find criminals. Okay, on that little note, just to give an input there, can I see hands of anybody who might want to make any... Oh, sorry, before we go there, I just want to thank our online audience for watching and participating in this today, or at least being part of this process, the seminar today. Thank you very much. Please keep an eye out on upcoming events from our website or our Facebook page or Twitter account. This section for the online audience will now be ending, and we'll be going to a session of question and answers with the audience here today live. So thank you very much. And now I'm over back to you.